Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to go over the scoring of the SHSAT, and specifically we're going to be looking at data from 2005 and 2006, so all test takers from that time. And there was actually a study done by somebody at the University of Colorado, and they were able to get this data, and so I'll put that study in the link to the video so that you guys can look at it. It's a very interesting study, but today we're just going to be going over the data, some of the data in the study, and we're going to be using that to look at how the SHSAT is scored. And then in the next video we're going to look at what that means in terms of your test taking strategy for this test. So if we look at table 1, we see the summary statistics of raw scores for both 2006 and 2005. So if we look at the verbal section, we see that the mean is around 25 for each test. So you can see that there are like 4 tests, A/B, C/D. So these are basically different versions of the test. So it looks like 4 versions of the test were given out to ensure test security. And the verbal and math are both range from 0 to 50. So there are 50 questions on each the verbal and the math in 2006. And so you can score anywhere from 0 questions correct to 50. So it looks like they designed it so that the average person got like half of the questions right on the verbal, and maybe slightly less than half on the math. And it looks like we have a similar trend in 2005. I guess the other thing to note here would be the standard deviation. So basically the standard deviation tells us like how spread out the data is. So the standard deviation being 10 kind of means that if you were to score like 1 standard deviation above the mean, so that would be 35, that would be pretty good. And then 2 standard deviations above the mean, like 45 questions correct, that would be like really good. So yeah, that's sort of an interpretation. So now let's look at the figures. So this is another way of representing the data. So it shows us how many test takers like got like what raw score. So we can see like from 0 to 5, most test takers got at least like 5 questions correct. And so it looks like the bulk of the data here is concentrated between like 10 and 40. So most test takers got like somewhere between 10 and 40 questions correct. And then fewer test takers got between like 40 and 50 questions correct, and between 0 and 10. So we sort of see this data concentrated in the middle here. And then let's scroll over to look at the math raw scores. So again, this curve looks a little bit different, right? We see that the mean is like slightly lower, and it's sort of skewed a little bit. So it's not really a uniform distribution. But it's kind of more spread out. So we can see that like, well, the average might be lower, more people are getting like these top scores. So between like 30 and 50. And so, yeah, it's just a little bit skewed. So let's keep scrolling down. So in figure 3, we sort of see this conversion between raw and scaled scores. And so the scaled scores are really what matter, because if you add the scaled score from verbal and math, that determines like your total score, which is used to like rank students basically. So for Stuyvesant, you need to get like 560 scaled score, whereas for some of the other specialized schools, you might need to get like between like a 500 and 530, and you can look at the cutoffs from past years. So in order to get, let's say, like a 500, you would need to get like 250 on each section. So that looks sort of like you might need to get like a high 30s number correct. So maybe like 38 questions correct in each section. And if we look at the shape of the curve here, it's also pretty instructive. So it looks like for the first few questions, you don't really get any points by answering them. And then once you get to like 4 questions, you sort of see this like sharp increase in points for each question you get correct, right? So from 4 to 10, your score, your subsection score increases from like 40 to like 150 for math. So that's a big increase. And then in this sort of like middle area, like from here to here, for each question you get correct, there's only like a tiny jump in score. And so the reason for this is because like a lot of students are getting like in this sort of like mid-range. And so there's not a lot of differentiation between those students, so they just calibrate it so that in this middle range, like you're getting like a very small increase for each question you answer correctly. And then after like 40 questions, it starts to ramp up again. So if you look at like, if you have like 49 correct answers and then you get 50 correct answers, you get like a jump in score of like plus 25 points, which is really huge. Whereas here it might just be like plus 4. So yeah, it sort of like ramps up at the beginning, and then it's pretty like slow increase in the middle, and then it increases fast at the end. And so you can, if we like sort of clear this a little bit, you can use this table to kind of gauge, like based on your practice tests, like how many you're getting correct and what that would actually translate to. And you might be thinking like, okay, this was the scaling for 2006, and it might be like different for 2022, and it might be different based on, the test version that you get. But based on like, so when I took this test back in 2016, I got 600, and I got like 3 questions wrong on the math, so that would be a 47 on the math, and then I got 2 reading comprehensions wrong and 1 scrambled paragraph wrong on the verbal. And scrambled paragraphs, they're not currently on the test, but they count for 2 points, so that would be 46 out of 50 on the verbal. And if you actually look at those 2 points, one is like slightly above 300, one is slightly below 300, they actually add up to somewhere around 600. So I kind of get the feeling that their scaling system actually doesn't like change that much from year to year. Like there might be minor variations, but I think this is actually a pretty reliable chart for the most part. And the sort of the takeaway from this is that like there are 2 takeaways. One is that in order to get into like most of the specialized high schools, you might need to score somewhere around here if you're getting an equal amount of verbal and math correct, so maybe like low to mid 80s. And then if you want to get into like Stuyvesant, their cutoff is a little bit higher, so you might need to get like 280s in each section, so maybe like somewhere in this range, so like mid 40s, or like high 80s for both of the sections. And then the other takeaway here is that doing really well in one section and like less well in another section. So if you look at, so let's do a little hypothetical here. So let's say you ace the math section and you only get like a 60% or 30 out of 50 on the verbal section. So your total score would be 360 on the math plus like 220 on the verbal, and that's 580, right? So that's good enough to get into basically any specialized school that you want, even though you're kind of doing like pretty mediocre on the verbal. You're actually doing only slightly better than average, right? Because remember, the average was like 25. But on on contrast, let's say instead of getting 30 right in one, 50 right in the other, you get like 40 right in each. So you get like 40 right in each right here. This might be like 255 plus 265, which is, let's see, what is that? Like 520. And this is actually not good enough to get into Stuyvesant. So it's actually better to do extremely well on one section and sort of mediocre on another, rather than like pretty good but not awesome on both sections. So it's sort of a peculiar scoring feature of this test. Yeah, and then if we look at the percentiles and scaled scores, this sort of is less important, but it gives you an indication of like how well you're doing compared to other people. So if you look like at a score of 300, this is like a very good score. It's pretty rare. Might be like the 98th or 99th percentile. And then the average scaled score is like maybe somewhere like a 200, right? Yeah, and then maybe the cutoff, if you're scoring equally around two sections for Stuyvesant, it might be like here. So it's like a very good solid score, like 96 percentile or something. But yeah, you can do differently in either section, and that might change things. So anyway, and it looks like for all of the schools, like if you're scoring equally in each, this is sort of like the 500 mark, a little bit above. So you need to be scoring like in the 90th percentile or like somewhere around there. Okay, yeah, so let's keep scrolling down. And so these next two figures sort of drive home the point that doing excellently in one part and doing mediocre in another part is better than doing equally good in both parts. So these lines show all combinations of math and verbal percentiles that satisfy like the school's cutoff. So for example, if we look at this black line for Stuyvesant, if you score, for example, at the 100th percentile in verbal, and you score in the 80th percentile in math, then you would get in. That would be a qualifying score, right? So this kind of shows us that, like, if we look at Brooklyn Tech, for the math, if you like ace it, you only need to get something like 10% on verbal, which is basically not much better than guessing. So if you were to ace it's worse than guessing, right? Because there are, like, to the best of my knowledge, 4 multiple choice questions on each. So if you were to ace the math and you were to literally like randomly guess on the verbal, you would probably end up somewhere around here and you would get in. You would also probably get into Bronx Science even if you ace the math. So the point is that acing one subject is really good on the SHSAT, right? It gives you a big boost. And then this sort of shows you a bunch of students, so like some who got in and some who didn't. So this student, for example, he aced the math. He only got in like 25% on the verbal. That means like 75% of students did better than him. 75% of students did better than this person, and he still got in because he did very well in the math, and that countered his poor verbal performance. On the contrast, like these students right here, these people didn't get in, even though like they got like around the 80th percentile in both math and verbal, and those are like very good scores, but it's not like outstanding in one subject, and so like even though this might not be fair, these students didn't get in due to this peculiar scoring feature of the test. So better to do like really well on one section, like the math or the verbal, rather than like equally well but not extremely well on either section. And yeah, this is sort of the takeaway from this test. I encourage you to look at the paper that I'm going to put in the link. This is where I got like all of the statistics, but a lot of the scoring information about the SHSAT that I found on other YouTube videos is sort of inaccurate and simplistic, and so I really wanted to give you like a rundown of how scoring actually works. And I think that obviously, while the NYC DOE doesn't publish the exact scaling or whatever, this is like as close to accurate as I think you're gonna get, and it's pretty accurate. So I would, base it off of this to the best of my knowledge. Yeah, all right. So in the next video, we're gonna be covering like test taking strategy and what you should do based on these like scaled scoring. So yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.